Ashley Fox, and this is OUTFOXED. Steve Wyche is the chief national reporter for NFL Network and co-hosts NFL Network's Gameday preview. Prior to joining the NFL Network in 2008, Steve covered the Atlanta Falcons for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and prior to that, the Washington Wizards for the Washington Post. He is a proud graduate of Howard University and a Minneapolis native. Welcome to OUTFOXED, Steve Wyche. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This is so great. I mean, we've known each other for so long, and I'm just so excited for your new venture because I know it's going to go well. So thanks again for having me on, Ash.
Thank you. We met in the early 2000s. I think it was 2000. You were covering the Washington Wizards for the Washington Post. I was covering the 76ers for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I was incredibly fortunate to meet you and have you as part of my inner circle, along with Mike Wilbon, David Aldridge, the late, great Brian Burwell. You guys did a lot for me, taught me kind of the ropes and how to maneuver the NBA. What did our industry look like back then?
Well, I mean, look, that's when newspapers were the driving force of all information coverage, right? You know, people were still picking up the actual paper product in places like Philadelphia and New York and whatnot. People were reading them on the trains to work. Same in DC, you know, when I was working for the Washington Post. So like we would report the stories that morning and then all of the news outlets would trickle things down. And, you know, you're talking about how we cover the NBA. That was a really interesting dynamic in terms of the overall newspaper industry, because that's where we learned to be great journalists. We were dealing with the fresh post Michael Jordan era with the Chicago Bulls and soon to be Michael Jordan era with the Washington Wizards. But you know, covering the NBA, that's when, you know, Shaq was in Orlando with Penny Hardaway. The Eastern Conference was great. The Knicks and the Miami Heat had a huge rivalry. So it was super exciting because we didn't have the mass amounts of media outlets. There was no Twitter. I mean, the internet was brand new. The internet was new, you know, in terms of, you know, the media industry in the early 2000s. So again, it was great for us because we learned to paint pictures with words. Paint pictures with words, tell stories and ways to amplify players with such a constant driving whirlwind of just news, but it couldn't be updated 5 times a day like it is now. It had to be updated overnight because the newspapers came out in the morning. So it was a very, very different time than what people understand now.
Well, and the sports departments at that time, I don't know how many people who looked like you were in your sports department, but there were not very many people who looked like me. And it seems like the NBA beat was a popular place for us to end up, if you could say that.
That was the stash spot, right? So, you know, in the newspaper industry, there were two stash spots. So everybody tended to have bureaus. Right. Even when I worked at the Miami Herald, we had a Fort Lauderdale bureau. And that's where the majority of employees there were probably women. And that's where your diversity was. Well, that's what the NBA was to sports departments. Like there weren't a ton of women or people of color covering the NFL, which there still aren't. Major League Baseball, which there still aren't. But the NBA, that was the stash spot. Let's put all the black aspiring sports writers or established sports writers on the NBA because I think it was the assumption of the decision makers, because black people like basketball. They can relate to people because they all grew up playing basketball, you know, blah, blah, blah. And that's, you know, that let's put the women on basketball because they play basketball. They don't play football. They don't play baseball, but there is women's basketball. So that was kind of the conscious easer of sports editors and hiring people when it came to diversity. Like I said, the overall industry, let's put them in the bureaus so we can meet certain numbers to say that we have diversity, but you won't see them in the main newsroom. And then the NBA, let's put I mean, I remember when I covered the Miami Heat, I replaced Amy Shipley, who went on to the Washington Post. And then when I covered, and that was, okay, now we've got our diversity hire covering the NBA. And the Washington Post newsroom was a little bit more diverse than most when I went there, with Michael Wilbon and David Aldridge, and Rachel Nichols was there. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, most newspapers, again, the NBA was the stash spot.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was stashed behind Stephen A. Smith, who was covering the Sixers when I arrived in Philly in 2000. So, and he was still making a name for himself. Obviously,
I was about to say, Ashley, let them know he wasn't Stephen A. He was Steve Smith.
Yes,
we know him as Steve. The A did not come around until he got a little bit bigger.
Right. I always say there's two different guys. One is Steve Smith and one is Stephen A.
Right.
So, but I know what I went through from a challenges perspective covering the NBA. What was it like for you?
Well, I mean, look, first off, as a man, what you went through, I cannot begin to imagine, because that's still when people were like women in locker rooms. As uncomfortable of a discussion as that is today, it was women like you and the Amy Shipleys of the world and Judy Batistas of the world, who were first going into locker rooms and having to deal with, okay, why are women still in here? What do they know about sports? Blah, blah, blah. So you went through probably a different experience than I did. Mine, I will say, because the majority of the players were black, the players were often happy to see me, because there weren't that many black beat reporters, whether written word or broadcast, who covered their teams. So they were happy to see me. Not that they necessarily got more comfortable with their conversations, but I could ask them questions that they might be more comfortable talking about. And that wasn't necessarily a cultural question or whatever, but mainly because my experience or the angle I asked them questions might be more relatable to them. And so I'm not saying it was much more, it was difficult being a white beat writer back then, because the majority of the coaches were white, the majority of the general managers were white, and absolutely the owners were white. So a lot of the information flow, especially as it pertained to personnel decisions and things like that, were still going to the white reporters, the Peter Vessies of the world, right? Mm-hmm. Remember guys like that were getting that information. Now, Peter could work the whole audience. He had great relationships with players and things like that as well. But we weren't as trusted in terms of, probably you as a woman, me as a minority, by front office folks and things like that. We had to really earn a significant amount of trust, which we did, which is why myself and you and David Aldridge and people like that, Stephen A., are still around, because we did our jobs very well. And we weren't just talking to the black players. We were gaining the trust of the white coaches and GMs. But I think that is where, especially as newspaper writers, we really had to show ourselves, because we had to show we knew how to report. We had to show we knew how to write. We had to show that we were clean on deadlines, sending clean copy on deadlines. There's a lot of things where we had to prove ourselves. And, fortunately, we all did.
Definitely. I mean, I remember Larry Brown was the head coach of the Sixers when I first started covering the team, and Billy King was the general manager. And my father had been a college basketball coach at Duke and Wake Forest back in the day, and was in the same age group with Larry. And they, Larry obviously is a Carolina guy. And I was at my second training camp with them, and I ran into him and Billy at a restaurant. And the first thing Larry says is, "You never told me you were Neil McGahee's daughter." He's like, "Why didn't you tell me that?" And I'm like, because I didn't want that define who I was, and I wanted to prove that I was capable of being an independent thinker and my own person, and earning his trust and respect that way. So, but I'll never forget that, running into them.
Yeah, I mean, and look, that was part of it. I mean, one thing in covering the NBA is these guys play 2 to 3 games a week. You're dealing with 13 players, 3 or 4 coaches in a front office, right? You're a family, but they're playing 82 games, and that's just regular season. I covered, the Miami Heat, who go deep into the playoffs every year. And then you've got, you're around them in training camp and stuff. So it's a really tight family. So that's where you really have to establish those relationships. And that's why covering the NBA, as someone who's covered the NFL now for more than 20 years, was great. I loved it because it was a family type of thing. It might not have been a functional family, but you had to really have relationships with a lot of different people from a lot of different age categories. And back then, Ashley, both you and I were much closer to the age of the players than we are now, where I'm definitely, by the gray hair, much more close to the age of the coaches and the front office guys. But that was another part of the dynamic as we look back at the evolution of our careers in this industry. That, when I reflect on these days, being able to establish relationships with Pat Riley down in Miami, and then Alonzo Mourning and Tim Hardaway, and then going to Washington, and Michael Jordan and Gilbert Arenas and guys like that, and Jerry Stackhouse, Doug Collins. It's really such a human relationship and human part of this, as well as the career part of it, that you really have to navigate through, and that's always going to be part of the game.
Mm-hmm. We think of the NBA as the most progressive league now. I think the NFL might be coming a little bit closer. But there was a time when the league airbrushed Allen Iverson's tattoos off a magazine cover. Yeah. David Stern implemented a dress code, which seems like ridiculous now, given how fashionable everyone is. How and why has it evolved since then?
Well, I mean, look, a part of it, people didn't know what to do with Allen Iverson. This is where, as beloved or as recognizable as he still is, people do not understand. He changed the game the way that, when I say the game, the overall perception of the game, the way that people like Madonna changed music in the 80s, or, some people who completely changed trends, because here's the small dude coming in with cornrows, the big T-shirt, the Yankees cap tipped to the side, that a lot of young people related to, right? Otherwise, people were very corporate. Some teams that said when you get on the airplane and you travel, you have to have a suit and tie. You have to have, your hair this way. Remember the New York Yankees when George Steinbrenner owned them? You couldn't have a beard and your hair had to be clipped a certain way. Like, everybody fell in line. Allen Iverson's like, I'm going to do what I want to do. If you want to find me, find me. And so, all of a sudden the NBA would see, if Allen Iverson was hurt, he's sitting on the bench, wearing the big T-shirt and the jeans that sag below his butt. And they're like, hey.
And the jewelry.
And the jewelry. Like, we can't have that element in our game. This is encouraging to the gangs. This is getting young people turned in the wrong direction. So David Stern said you had to have a suit and, or at least I think a sport coat. I don't think you had to wear a tie, but you had to wear a sport coat and slacks. Like, you couldn't have the baggy jeans. I think you could wear sneakers. And look, the majority of the public then agreed with it. But the funny part was, all the kids who were reading Slam magazine, and it black kids, white kids, surfer kids, academic kids, they were still dressing like AI. They were rocking the AI Sixers jersey, the hat cocked to the side, and the baggy jeans, and either the Van sneakers or basketball gym shoes. So it didn't change. You just had two different eras. And this is where I give Allen Iverson so much credit, because he was himself. And I know he was a pain in the ass for you to cover. But he really put basketball in an interesting window, because you can try and I'll sit on the bench in my sport coat. I won't get fined for that. But when I'm doing my press conference and doing stuff like that, I'm going to be me. And that's what resonated probably with more of the general public. We don't think of Allen Iverson wearing the sport coat on the bench. We think of Allen Iverson wearing the baggy white T-shirt and the baggy jeans. And again, I think this is where a part of his lore gets lost, because he was such a great basketball player, and a controversial basketball player. But he changed a whole dynamic of society in terms of fashion, attitude. He was the hip hop dude. He got the rappers wanting to be like him. He even did his rap thing. So it just crossed a lot of, this was one of the real big first cross-cultural fashion, music, sport, entertainment athletes that we've had. Because even Michael Jordan and Kobe and guys like that were very much corporate and in line with the way David Stern wanted the NBA to be perceived.
The thing about Alan that I always regret, and I used to tell him this from time to time, I wish he would have talked to the media more. I mean, he always talked after a game and would talk occasionally, at practice. But he was such an intelligent basketball player, and his perspectives and understanding of the game were so interesting. And I don't think the public or fans got to see that enough. And I think he kind of did a disservice to himself because, now even, we're still talking about practice, but there was so much more to him than that.
That's interesting. And I want to ask you this as I reset this and give you my perspective. I think in today's media world, he'd be a rock star, right? He'd be like Marshawn Lynch, a guy who didn't talk to the media, but is now killing it because he's got all these avenues to get his own message out, right? To be able to go on Twitter or Instagram or do his own podcast and do his thing. That's where I think he would be so glorious in today's environment. But back then we had newspapers and we had the evening news, right? It was a different cycle where as messengers may have perceived as people who would misinterpret their message, right? How many players did you say, I know it comes out looking like this in quotes, but that's not how I really meant it. And you can see how that can get twisted with the printed word or even the video of him doing that as to how he really wanted his message to come across. So do you think, and again, this is where I said it back to you, from the era Allen Iverson played, if he was in today's era where he could do his own thing, don't you think he'd be much more of a rock star?
I do, especially if he wanted to. I mean, can you imagine him having a podcast or having his Instagram account and posting videos and doing it his way and controlling the message? I mean, I think we're in such an interesting point with social media and athletes that they can control their own message now, and they don't need the media. And, they can get their own persona out there that then leads to other off the field opportunities, endorsement deals, commercials. I mean, good Lord, we can't turn on a commercial or see a commercial that doesn't have Travis Kelce or Patrick Mahomes in it right now. So I do. And I love Alan. Let's back up for a minute. You played football at the University of Missouri, correct?
I was on the team. I never stepped on the field. I was on the team. I wasn't good enough.
Okay. Well, so you were but you still practiced, so you still played.
Oh, yeah.
And then you transferred to Howard.
Yep.
An HBCU. What was that transition like, and what impact did that have on you?
Yeah, this was, that's a great question because, growing up between Minneapolis and St. Louis, right in the Midwest, and both my parents went to Hampton Institute, which is an HBCU now known as Hampton University, but it is not the real HU. That is Howard University. But it was but I mean, just growing up, and when I started getting recruited for football, I never got recruited by an HBCU. I was getting recruited by Kansas State and Kansas and Tulsa and schools like that. And my mother's like, why don't you go to Grambling? Why don't you go to Southern? I was like, I don't know if they like me. They never sent me a letter, unbeknownst to me is they didn't have the recruiting budget to really, come get kids from St. Louis or places like that. They tended to stay, since most HBCUs are in the mid-Atlantic and Southeast, they tended to kind of recruit from that pocket. So, and plus I just wanted to go, all the kids want to go to the big state schools, right? People there in Pennsylvania want to go to Penn State, right? People in Ohio want to go to Ohio State. So I wanted to go to the University of Missouri. They were very good back then. And when they came after me, it was like, okay, great. And I went down there and I really just didn't like it. I didn't thrive academically. I was always a good student in high school. The football stuff did not go well. Like I said, I wasn't very good. And we changed coaches after my redshirt year. And the new coaching staff made it abundantly clear I was not going to be one of their guys. So I was going to transfer to come out to California to University of the Pacific when they had, it's our school like that, a smaller school. And a buddy of mine one of the few black kids from my town in Manchester, Missouri, said, we should go to an HBC. We should go to a black school. I said, you know what? My mother's been saying it. I've never actually really grew up around black people since I lived out in the suburbs. Let's do it. So I sent inquiry letters to Howard and Hampton. The coach at Howard was Willie Jeffries, who had recruited me, and he was at Wichita State. So he knew of me. He said, come to Howard. All right, I'm going to Howard. Well, I would have had to sit out another year. So after having a redshirt a year at Missouri, and that'd be like 2.5 years, I really would not have been on a field. So to use the old football adage, Ashley, I lost my stinger, right? I was a former high school quarterback, grew in size to be an outside linebacker, just lost my edge. So I said, okay, I'm going to go be a student. I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., where I had never been, to this all-black university, which I had never experienced. At the time in the 80s, Washington, D.C. was the murder capital of the world. Crack was infiltrating the city. So I'm completely out of my element. And it was the best thing in the world for me. I became a man in 3 days. There were plenty of kids, suburban kids like me from Howard, but there are also kids from Jamaica and Germany and Alaska and all of these places. Like a kid from the Midwest had never met people from Detroit, right? And so and then I got pushed so hard academically. Like when I was going to school at University of Missouri, I'm in classes with 250 students. When I was at Howard, I'm in classes with 30 students. And I'm in class with Stan Verrett, right, who's the ESPN Sports Center anchor, with Michelle Miller, who's on CBS Good Mornings, Gus Johnson, who is on Fox. Like we're all together. Like we're all there at once. And it's all these high achieving students who pushed me like I had never been pushed outside of the classroom to career-wise, and professors who were totally invested in me. So I took all that competitive energy that I used to spend on the athletic field and said, you know what, I'm going to make something of myself as a journalist and be good and really pursue it. And I'm one of the few people, and you can probably speak to this, Ashley, like a lot of folks who graduate with don't get to pursue careers that they majored in or that are really their passion. And, I've always wanted to do this, and I'm still doing it. And I could not be more blessed or fortunate to be doing it.
Mm-hmm. That's a great story. I did not know that about Stan and Gus, and that you guys were all together.
We're all together. And there are others, Frederica Whitfield, who's on CNN. We were all together. That's
so cool. Yeah, I always wanted to do it too. I mean, I took a journalism class my sophomore year of high school and was hooked. And my father, who hated the media, especially sports writers, told me, don't get into this because you're not going to make any money. It's going to be too hard for you because you're a female. And I did it anyway, much to his chagrin. So I understand.
Yeah, I got into it because I sucked at science and math.
Yeah, same. Still do. Yeah, I could write and I could edit and I could diagram sentences, but I couldn't do long division for sure. No. Not at all. As you know, I started covering the NFL in 2003. I left the NBA beat because I got pregnant and I couldn't sustain the schedule and the rigors of covering 82 games, as you said, and late nights and early morning flights and all that. I started covering the Eagles. And at the time, I was one of two women in that locker room. And on a day-to-day basis. And I had the great fortune of working with Claire Smith, the legendary Claire Smith, who was a columnist at the Philadelphia Inquirer. How has the NFL media landscape changed since then?
In so many ways, because it really hasn't. But again, back then, newspapers were the driving force. Now you have regional networks. Teams have their own broadcast teams. And it's just so vast. You have these gambling sites now that have their own broadcast. So there's a million different ways, whereas the newspapers have really shrunk and become far less of an entity, even though they're there every day. And I think they're absolutely crucial to get the most precise coverage of any particular team. In terms of like diversity, there are more women. In some markets, there are more people of color. In some markets, not all, but it's really, like I remember years ago, back when Torrey Smith and LeGarrette Blount and a bunch of guys were with the Eagles, back when, Chris Long, and their kind of Super Bowl run. I remember going to that locker room, and I mean, the Eagles have a massive media staff, right? They're media coverage. There probably are 20 people there every day. And I think I maybe saw one black reporter. And this is like when stuff was really culturally popping, post Colin Kaepernick, things like this. And I went up to some of these guys like, what's it like, man? I mean, just every day not having somebody who looks like you color. And they're like, it's an issue. Like, we've brought it to our media relations program. We've got all this stuff, we're very pro voter registration. We've got all these things we want to do. But, these guys never ask us about it. They never, and if they do, it comes from a perspective of kind of being a rebel. I was like, that's interesting. And then I look at the Eagles media relations department, and they didn't have anybody of color. So they probably didn't see what some of these guys were seeing, because they didn't have anybody on their staff who could call up a newspaper editor and say, hey, look, we've got some players here who'd like to see some more diversity. But that's not every market. It still is in a lot of markets. But I think the biggest change in just the overall coverage with the NFL is, one, the NFL does an incredible job as a machine of having its name in the media 365 days a year. There's no league that is talked about like the NFL. It is the king. And you and I know this. Covering the NBA, like, it's not even close. Like, I've seen the numbers, like the engagement and everything, fandom, whatever. The NFL is like twice as large as the NBA, which is second, and then Major League Baseball and Premier League Soccer. So the enormity of it is gigantic. Covering it, again, you're fighting a lot of different battles. I will say this, which interests me, Ashley, in terms of the media, is we all have these insiders, right? NBA, Major League Baseball, MMA, whatever, NFL. Do you know, at all of the major networks, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been a big follower of this, there's only one person of color who's an insider, a true, like, who everybody goes to, insider, and that's Jonathan Jones of CBS for the NFL. Like, even though he just retired, the Woj bomb was who he went to in the NFL or NBA, right? And now we got Shams out there, and hopefully he gets some opportunities. But, NFL, it's Adam Schefter, Ian Rappaport, Tom Pelissero, some of those guys, Major League Baseball. And that's where I think media, we typecast a lot of people. You see a lot of black folks on TV talking about the NFL, but almost all of them are former players. Very few trained journalists. Women tend to get cast a certain way, either sideline reporters, the occasional host, where they often defer, and their intelligence and knowledge of the game is often cast aside for shouting blather. And that's where I think the media landscape needs to kind of look at itself and say, are people of color and women genetically predisposed to not be able to be insiders and grinders like those guys? Can these people do other things? And then that's why I just think because I think when I talk to a lot of young people and they say, I want to be a sideline reporter, I'm like, why? Do you know you spend half your season in rain and freezing cold, and it sucks when you're out there for 4 hours to be on TV for about a total of 90 seconds? Like, that's, it's something to aspire, but that's what they see. Mm-hmm. And so, that's when, if we're looking at it from the media lens, that's my big gripe. That's where I stand on my soapbox.
I love it. Stand on that soapbox, Steve. One person who has broken into media that you and I both covered as a player is Michael Vick. We talked about the Iverson effect. Vick, you covered at that point in his career where he got arrested and convicted for dogfighting while he was with the Falcons. I covered him when he came out of federal prison, which was a very polarizing thing when he re-entered the NFL. What impact do you think that story and Michael himself had on the NFL and continues to have?
God. Well, I mean, first off, I'm so proud of him. I mean, he's grown up so much as a man and as a person, as a husband. And the documentary he got on Prime Video, The Evolution of Black Quarterback, is absolutely amazing because, the first part of it, he goes through the historical figures of Doug Williams and James Harris. The second part, he goes with his contemporaries, the Rodney Peets and guys like that. And then the last episode, the guys who looked up to him, the Cam Newtons and Colin Kaepernicks and Jalen Hurts. It's fantastic. And for him to do something like that, to me, really struck a nerve because when he played, he didn't want to ever talk about that. And remember, he was very much in the Iverson era. They're from the same hometown. They carried themselves the same way. And he would not conform. And then he gets thrown in jail. Remember, Mike Vick was one of the first $100 million football players, right? He was as big as LeBron James is in the NBA right now, right? He is as big as Shohei Ohtani is in Major League Baseball. He was that popular. I think one of the first football players to actually have his own cleat, because apparel companies didn't make cleats because you can't wear them around every day. You can only wear them when you compete. And for him to lose so much, he lost his money, he lost his stature for fighting dogs. I think shocked him and shocked a lot of people around the world, and I'm at the NFL Network because of the coverage I did at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution over this dogfighting scandal. And I think it was an interesting human dynamic because a lot of people make the argument, well, he didn't kill a human person. And I'm like, well, and the more I got into this and the covering of it, like you realize that most of us probably don't know somebody who's been murdered or even have a second or third level of someone who's been part of a violent crime, but we've all pet a dog, we've all hugged a cat, right? And so that's why it was just so incredibly disruptive to so many people, where every day the Falcons practice for freaking 6 months had protesters. And where Mike, when he went to Philly afterwards, people were like, I can never forgive him. I'll never be an Eagles fan for having this dog killer on my team. And so now Mike accepts, he accepts that not everyone's going to like him, but not everyone ever did because he was so unique and so different. But the way he's grown and the way it's impacted so much, I mean, society, like we haven't heard of this again. Like if athletes are doing it, they're being careful about it, which is hard to do in this world of phone cameras. Or camera phones, however you want to have it. But I think it let a lot of the athletes know that they are under a different type of microscope. It let a lot of organizations, like the Falcons, didn't handle this well. That you have to know your people. Like all these teams have security people with the background checks they do on guys before they even get to the NFL is crazy extensive now because this was so disruptive to a society. And not just, the Atlanta Falcons or Michael Vick. I mean, this really, in Atlanta, it split the city in half. I mean, to this day, family members still don't talk to each other because of this. So it has echoed in a lot of different ways. But in terms of the man, Michael Vick, you talk about a redemption story. I mean, this is right there at the top.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Steve, we've both covered the NFL's long issue with minority hiring at the head coaching level. This year, there are 9 minority head coaches, 6 African Americans. The league seems, if you compare the numbers to past years, to have moved forward finally on this issue. Do you think that's true? And what's next?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I think it's going to ebb and flow. And, where I give the NFL a lot of credit is, they really have encouraged teams to put coaches of color in the so-called pipeline, right? Put them in the quarterback room, put them in the offensive coordinator room, because typically coaches of color, if they coach on offense, they coach running backs and wide receivers, but a lot of them coach on defense. And that's where you saw most of your minority head coaches, even someone like Ron Rivera, were defensive leaders. And so, I give the NFL a lot of credit for that. It took time. Owners have had more open minds, but it took a lot of public outcry from media, from coaches, from Brian Flores suing the NFL and other minority coaches joining him in that lawsuit, to just some owners saying, some of these guys are actually like the best candidates. But I mean, there's just so many things in place, even at these league meetings where they invite minority prospective coaches and general managers to actually have dinner, to have kind of speed dating coffee with these owners, so that these owners can say, oh, wow, I remember when we spoke to this guy, let's bring him back and interview him for this position. We may not have something open now, but a couple years from now, so that process, I think, has really worked. Again, it's going to ebb and flow. There's not always going to be 9 coaches of color in the NFL, but as long as we don't go back to where we were 3 or 4 years ago, where there were like 3 coaches of color and owners weren't even looking or considering some of these guys, and they were allowing head coaches who partially were to blame for this, for not having diversity on their coaching staffs. That's what you kind of hope things don't go back to. But I will say this, as a person of color, you want to hire the right people. If you hire people in any aspect of life just because of their gender or their color or their sexuality, just to check a box, and they're not the right ones, that's going to make you look bad. So always hire the right people, but always have an open mind to say that people of color or women or whatever are objectively just as wise or as competent as somebody who might be a white male.
Mm-hmm. You've seen and done a lot in your career, obviously. Do you have a favorite moment or experience?
Oh gosh. I mean, we're shooting fish in a barrel right here. I mean, look, some of the more fun experiences I had is like when I would cover some of the big heavyweight fights, just seeing the adrenaline with that. Some of the people in the audience. I mean, there's nothing like being at a major event like that. In terms of impact, I mean, nothing has been bigger for me than being the first person to notice that Colin Kaepernick did not stand for the national anthem, and reporting on that in a way where I felt the why. We have the 5 pillars of journalism: the who, what, when, where, why, where I thought the why was far more important than the what. And I think the resounding reaction was the what was far more important than the why. But the fact that it still resonates, it's 2024 now, and this happened in 2016, and it's still front and center. I mean, this is something that I don't think you can write modern day American history without that chapter. So that is something that career-wise is right there, in a career with a lot of big stories that I've reported on, and very important and culturally and socially changing stories I reported on. That's probably number one. But I mean, there's a million big moments. I mean, you and I have been at some of them in the NBA, the Michael Jordan moments, things like that. So I got a long list. I got a long list of them. One of my favorite thing is probably going to be able to do the Pro Football Hall of Fame every year. But there's a lot of different things that I could touch on with that question.
Mm-hmm. What's your theory or opinion about why Kaepernick never played again? Can you say
the teams didn't want him in their locker room, and I think teams have different perspectives on that, right? Some teams didn't want him there because they knew the fan base would absolutely lose it, right? I'll never forget the first game he started after that was in Buffalo. And I'm walking into the stadium and people have like rifle scopes with Cap's silhouette on their T-shirts. I'm like, hey, this is like, these people are like, I felt really like scared for him. I think other people realized they were heavy military markets and they relied on that fan base, and that we don't want to push. And I just frankly think some owners were like, I don't want this in my locker room because our players may gravitate more towards him than our starting quarterback. So it was a really awkward thing, because some teams clearly sacrificed wins for not bringing him into their locker room. There are a couple teams that had so many injuries and they're 4 and 5 deep and they're getting guys off the street. And you're like, this dude here quarterbacked the team to the Super Bowl when the 49ers he's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL for several years. But it was clear, I think teams had their different reasons, but they just they knew one way or another the attention was always going to come back to him not standing for the national anthem.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy. All right, we're going to close with a couple of quick hits for you.
Yep.
If you could give your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be?
Be far more attentive to detail. Just, from everything from grammatical things in writing a story to taking the impact of a report on somebody's life more seriously. Instead of just doing my job saying, hey, you know what? If I really put this out there, it could really have a negative or a controversial impact on somebody's life.
That's interesting. What is the elusive thing for which you are still striving, Steve?
The elusive thing for which I'm still striving, I think I've got inner peace. I think I've got all these deep Zen type things. You know what? I think the elusive thing that I'm still striving for is really, and it's very personal to me, and I've always taken it this way, is to make sure that young people, especially with my background, with Black background, Indigenous, women, get to call the shots. I am 58 years old. I have been in this business since 1989. I have never worked for a supervisor of color. So I think that is my mission. People here at the NFL Network will tell you that. I'm very active in trying to set up things to get that to happen and to train people to think that way, that instead of maybe being in front of the camera, think about the people who hires the people to be in front of the camera. But I think that's probably my elusive carrot right now.
Next job, perhaps?
That might be me. That might be me being my own boss.
It's pretty fun. You should try it. In your Twitter your X profile, you say, always keep it real, love, peace, soul.
Yes.
And that's kind of what we hear at OUTFOXED, mostly sports with soul. That's what we talk about. What does soul mean to you in terms of your career and your life?
Well, first of all, I took that phrase from the great Don Cornelius, who signed off on Soul Train every week with love, peace, and soul. But what do I consider soul? I mean, I think it's just the inner you, just be real, man. I think you and I have lasted this long because can we cuss?
Sure.
There's no bullshit to us, right? We've learned how to navigate things by, sometimes exercising charm and sometimes exercising nuance and not stepping on any toes. But I think soul is just being a genuine you. And when I say a genuine you, like some people are just shitty people. That's not soul. I think soul is treating people a certain way as to where even if you don't like them or they don't like you, you guys can understand each other on a certain level.
I love that. Well, and if I haven't told you lately, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for everything you've done for me. We met at a perfect time in my career, and you helped teach me, protect me, look out for me, have a drink with me, whatever it was. So I appreciate you. I appreciate our friendship, and I'm proud of you. So,
well, I love you, Ash. We went through a lot together, and I'm so happy for you and this OUTFOXED and this project you're taking on. You being a great mother. I am just so proud of you, and to see how we've both matured, but how you've really taken what life gives to you, absorbed it, and just grown into just like the most amazing human being. So thank you for having me. Thank you for your kind words, and just love you to death.
All right. Love you too, Steve. Thanks.
OUTFOXED is a mostly sports podcast with soul. Hosted by me, Ashley Fox. OUTFOXED is proudly produced in Philadelphia by Dearest Media in collaboration with Blow My Mind podcast.